For 4,500 years, the Great Sphinx of Giza has watched the sun rise over the desert, carved from a single ridge of solid limestone, the largest monolithic statue on Earth. In 1992, a geologist stood in the pit that surrounds it and said something that would split Egyptology in two. This monument might be thousands of years older than any pharaoh. Look closely at the walls around the Sphinx and you see something strange: deep vertical grooves, rounded and flowing, the kind of scarring water leaves behind, not sand, not wind. And there has been no real rain here in 5,000 years. So where did the water come from, in a desert that has not seen real rainfall in over 5,000 years? That single question would pit a lone geologist against the entire discipline of Egyptology, and 30 years later, neither side has fully won. If the erosion is real, the Sphinx was not carved by the builders of the pyramids at all. It was already ancient when they found it, a monument from a civilization history has no name for. This is the story of the Great Sphinx, what mainstream archaeology can prove, what one controversial theory claims, and why a 73-foot lion with a human face still keeps its oldest secret. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau outside Cairo, at the edge of the desert where the Nile Valley meets the sand, guarding the approach to three great pyramids. It is carved almost entirely from the bedrock itself, a body of a reclining lion 240 feet long, 66 feet tall, with the head and face of a man. Workers cut a deep horseshoe-shaped pit around it to free the stone, leaving the Sphinx sitting below the level of the surrounding plateau, as if the desert itself had been carved away from around it. Its builders used the harder limestone blocks quarried from that pit to build temples right beside it, stone taken from the Sphinx's own trench and dragged only a short distance to be set in place. For most of its life, the Sphinx has spent long centuries buried to its neck in windblown sand, its body hidden, only the head rising above the dunes like a stone sentinel. That burial protected the body from erosion for most of its history, which makes the weathering that is visible on the exposed stone even harder to simply explain away. The accepted answer: the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BCE, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, builder of the second Great Pyramid at Giza. Egyptologists believe workers quarried limestone for Khafre's pyramid complex, and rather than waste the awkward stone left in the pit, they shaped it into a colossal guardian figure. A stone causeway once ran from the Sphinx down to a valley temple on the edge of the Nile floodplain, part of the same building program as Khafre's pyramid and tomb. Inside that valley temple in 1860, excavators found a magnificent diorite statue of Khafre himself, seated, a falcon god wrapped protectively around the back of his crown. The face carved on that statue and the face carved on the Sphinx are strikingly, deliberately similar, evidence Egyptologists treat as close to conclusive. Centuries later, New Kingdom pharaoh Thutmose IV had a stone slab placed between the Sphinx's paws, describing how the monument came to him in a dream, already half swallowed by sand, and asked to be dug free. That inscription, the Dream Stele, calls the Sphinx ancient even by the standards of a king who ruled a full 1,000 years after Khafre, describing it as a thing already old and half forgotten in his own time. It never claims the Sphinx predates Khafre, but it does confirm the monument was already an object of awe and neglect long before New Kingdom Egypt rediscovered it. The Greek historian Herodotus toured Egypt around 450 BCE and wrote pages about the pyramids, yet never once mentioned the Sphinx by name, a silence some find suspicious and others simply blame on centuries of sand burial. In the 20th century, archaeologist Mark Lehner spent years mapping the Giza Plateau stone by stone, matching quarry marks in the Sphinx pit to blocks used in Khafre's causeway and temples. His team also uncovered a nearby settlement, bakeries, worker housing, cattle bones, and a cemetery, the physical footprint of the very laborious believed to have built the pyramids and the Sphinx together. Seal jar labels, worker graffiti, and tool marks throughout the Giza complex all point to the same narrow window of time, the middle of Egypt's 4th dynasty. To most Egyptologists, that is simply overwhelming evidence: quarry, temple, statue, and settlement, all one coherent building project, all dated to one king's reign. But not everyone accepts that the story ends there. In the late 1980s, a Boston University geologist was invited to Giza to examine the Sphinx not as an archaeologist, but as a scientist reading stone. He was not looking for hieroglyphs or pottery. He was looking at how the limestone itself had worn away, layer by layer, over time. What he found did not match the story everyone had agreed on for 2 centuries, and once he said so publicly, the reaction from Egyptology was immediate and unforgiving. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure showed deep, Rounded, vertical channels, running straight down the rock face like water had poured over them again and again, for a very long time. Wind erosion in Egypt cuts horizontally, following the grain of the blowing sand. This pattern ran the wrong way entirely, top to bottom, the unmistakable signature geologists associate with rainfall runoff. The geologist's conclusion was radical. For the enclosure walls to erode like that, Giza would have needed centuries, maybe millennia, of sustained heavy rainfall, a climate Egypt has not had since the end of the last ice age. The last period wet enough to produce that kind of erosion, he argued, ended somewhere between 5 and 7,000 BCE, and possibly earlier still. If he was right, the Sphinx's body could be 7,000 years old at minimum, and by some estimates far older, carved long before Khafre, long before the pyramids, long before written Egyptian history begins. Writer John Anthony West had first raised the idea, and brought the geologist to Giza specifically to test it with a scientist's eye instead of an archaeologist's assumptions. Together they proposed something startling. An unknown, much older culture carved the lion body first, out of the natural rock ridge, long before dynastic Egypt existed at all. Later, they argued, Khafre's people found the eroded, faceless monument already standing, and simply recarved its worn head into the likeness of their own king. That would explain something that has puzzled visitors for 2 centuries. The Sphinx's head looks strangely small for its enormous lion body, almost as if it had been reduced and reshaped from something larger. A full stone lion's head, scaled properly to a body 240 feet long, would be far bigger and more imposing than the modest human head sitting there now. To the water erosion theorists, that mismatch was not an accident of the original design. It was evidence of a second, later carving. The theory had a name that stuck, the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis, and it did not stay confined to geology journals for long. Geologists studying the Giza Plateau describe the bedrock in distinct layers of the Mukatam Formation, softer bands prone to crumbling laid beneath harder caps, a natural banding that on its own can produce rounded, uneven weathering easy to mistake for something more dramatic. Writers Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock picked up the theory soon after and connected it to something even bigger than geology, the slow, predictable drift of the night sky itself. The Sphinx faces due east, watching the sun rise on the spring equinox. Run that sunrise backward through the slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis, and around 10,500 BCE, the sun would have risen directly in front of a very different constellation, Leo, the lion. In that epoch, Bauval and Hancock argued, a lion-bodied monument facing a lion-shaped constellation at dawn was no coincidence. It was a deliberate act of sky-mirroring astronomy. They called it the Sphinx's true birth date, the age of Leo, a span of centuries, thousands of years before Egypt's first dynasty even began, long before hieroglyphs, long before the Nile calendar. It is a striking idea, tying architecture, geology, and astronomy into a single ancient date. It is also almost entirely unprovable by direct evidence, resting on interpretation rather than anything you could excavate or carbon date. No inscriptions, no artifacts, no settlement layer, no trace of any culture capable of quarrying stone on that scale from 10,500 BCE has ever been found anywhere near Giza. Mainstream Egyptologists point out that a monument can face east for religious reasons alone, without needing a precise stellar alignment 8,000 years before the pharaohs. Still, the water erosion evidence and the astronomical argument together turned a niche geology paper into one of the most famous fringe theories in archaeology. Egyptology did not stay quiet. Geologists and archaeologists pushed back hard, and the rebuttal was just as detailed as the original claim. Critics pointed to a simpler explanation for the vertical channels, not rainfall from 10,000 years ago, but ordinary Egyptian weathering acting on soft, uneven limestone layers for 45 centuries, helped along by salt crystallizing out of groundwater and morning condensation. Giza's limestone was laid down in alternating hard and soft bands. Softer layers crumble faster, sometimes leaving rounded vertical-looking scars that can resemble old water channels without a single drop of rain. Some geologists also noted that the Sphinx enclosure sat close to the ancient floodplain water table, meaning centuries of rising and falling groundwater, not sky rainfall, could account for much of the deep weathering. There was also the matter of the evidence. Critics said the water erosion theory had not adequately explained the quarry marks, the causeway, the diorite statue, the workers' village, all still pointing to Khafre's 4th dynasty. A later discovery, an inscribed slab called the Inventory Stela, once seemed to support an older sphinx, claiming the monument already stood in the time of Khufu. Khafre's own father. But most Egyptologists date the Inventory Stela's writing style to nearly 2,000 years after Khufu, a late-period temple text retelling an old legend, not a contemporary record. As for the small head on a large body, mainstream Egyptologists have a simpler answer. The original carving was always modest in proportion to the body, later reshaped and recut more than once by different kings restoring it. Multiple pharaohs after Khafre are recorded repairing and recarving the Sphinx's face over the centuries, which alone could account for a head that looks reworked. No verified excavation anywhere on the Giza Plateau has ever produced a single artifact, seal, or settlement layer that can be reliably dated older than the early Old Kingdom. One more Sphinx mystery has nothing to do with water or stars, and it is the detail almost every visitor notices first: the statue's missing nose. Popular legend blames Napoleon soldiers, supposedly firing a cannon at the face for target practice in 1798. European sketches of the Sphinx made decades before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt already show the nose gone, which rules that story out completely. A 15th-century Arab historian recorded an earlier account. A Sufi ascetic named Muhammad Saim al-Dar defaced the face around 1378 CE, offended by villagers making offerings to the statue. Whether that story is fully accurate or partly legend itself, one thing is certain: by the time Europeans arrived with sketchbooks and cannons, the nose had already been gone for centuries. It is a small reminder that even the Sphinx's best documented, most recent history is tangled up with rumor, myth, and incomplete records, centuries before anyone even reaches the harder questions about its true age. So after 30 years of geology papers, television specials, and Egyptological rebuttals, where does the water erosion hypothesis actually stand today? Firmly outside the mainstream, but not entirely dismissed. A handful of geologists still find the vertical channeling pattern genuinely puzzling, even if they reject the 10,000-year date that came with it, unwilling to explain it away entirely as ordinary weathering. Most working Egyptologists remain confident. The archaeological context around the Sphinx, the quarry, the temple, the statue, the settlement, is simply too consistent to overturn on erosion patterns alone. What nobody disputes is that direct scientific dating of the stone itself is still essentially impossible. You cannot carbon date solid rock the way you can date organic material. Every date attached to the Sphinx, mainstream or fringe, rests on interpreting evidence around it, never a direct reading of the monument's own age. That gap, between what the stone might reveal and what science can actually extract from it, is exactly where 30 years of argument have lived. It is also why the debate has never fully closed. No matter how many geology conferences or Egyptology journals have weighed in, each side publishing rebuttals to rebuttals that stretch back 3 decades now. Every theory, orthodox or radical, is ultimately a story people tell about a face carved, buried, uncovered, and recarved so many times that its true first shape may simply be unrecoverable. Stand at the Sphinx today and you are looking at 2 irreconcilable timelines occupying the same 73 feet of stone, one that says an Egyptian king carved a monument to himself 45 centuries ago, and one that says he only refaced something already ancient beyond memory. The wind that carved those strange vertical scars, whether it was rain from a lost climate or 4,000 years of ordinary weathering, is still working on the limestone today, grain by grain, the same slow erosion that will keep reshaping the question long after this debate is settled. Modern conservation teams now monitor every crack and flake, patching and stabilizing the stone, trying to preserve whichever version of the story turns out to be true. For now, the Great Sphinx keeps facing east, the way it has for thousands of years, watching a sunrise that may or may not be the same one it was built to greet, still the oldest question carved into stone that anyone has ever asked and never fully answered.